Let's now consider one of the problems that people raise, that critics raise for utilitarianism. So we looked at some of the criticisms of Kantian ethics, and they came from, we saw them coming from John Stuart Mill himself, from utilitarians. Well, Kantians don't just, whatever. They don't just sit back and let all these critics. They attack utilitarianism as well. And so what we're going to look at is one of the kinds of criticisms that Kantians make. This one actually comes from someone we've read earlier at the first part of the semester, Judith Jarvis Thompson. I've mentioned here and there that she's somewhat of a Kantian, and that's right. Here's how she, a Kantian, would attack utilitarianism. So this is a thought experiment, right? That's what she does. She does thought experiments. A thought experiment from a different paper that she wrote. It's called Killing, Letting Die, and the Trolley Problem, famous paper. Here's what she says. So this is a kind of thought experiment, and it creates a problem for utilitarianism, right? And there are a lot of different thought experiments like this, but we'll just look at this one. All right, so here's the story. David's a great transplant surgeon. 5 of his patients need new parts. One needs a heart, the others need liver, stomach, spleen, and spinal cord, right? So they all need different parts. Otherwise, they're going to die. That's the idea. And all are of the same relatively rare blood type. By chance, David learns of a healthy specimen with that very blood type, right? A healthy specimen. There's another patient in the hospital or whatever who has that same rare blood type. David can take the healthy specimen's parts, killing him, right? If you take the heart, liver, stomach, spleen, and spinal cord out of a person, they're going to die, right? So he could take this healthy person's parts, thereby killing him, but then install them in his patients, in his five sick patients, thereby saving them. Or he can refrain from taking the healthy specimen's parts, letting his patients die. So this thought experiment presents the utilitarian with an option, or really the consequentialist with an option. On the one hand, David can let his 5 patients die, in which case one person lives, the healthy specimen lives, the healthy patient lives, and then these 5 other patients die. On the other hand, since he's such a great surgeon, and don't worry about the practical feasibility of this, that just assume it's practically feasible, even though it's not. But on the other hand, David could chop up, essentially, the one healthy guy, take his parts, and then transplant them into these 5 patients, thereby saving them. And then they go on and live their lives, right? So on the one hand, and if that's the way he went, then you'd have 5 people dying and 5 people living and 1 person dying. And so it seems like David's choice, one way you can put it, it's like, well, he's got to choose between, if we're looking at his consequences, he has to choose between 5 people living and 1 dying, or 5 people dying and 1 living. And if consequences are all that matter, well, it seems like 5 people living, 1 dying is better than 5 people dying and 1 living. And so it seems like utilitarianism is going to have to say that David ought to chop up the 1 guy and save the 5 sick patients. Assume that the 1 healthy guy, right, he's just there for his annual checkup. And he didn't volunteer to do this. He didn't want to do this. He wants to go on with his life. He's, whatever, right? So you don't want to die. Utilitarianism seems to imply that David ought to murder that 1 guy to save the other 5. Okay, well, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is that it's clearly wrong. That's clearly the wrong answer. Whatever else is true about ethical theory and so on, it's any ethical theory that's even going to pretend to command our assent has got to say that it'd be immoral for David to chop up the 1 guy to save the 5. Clearly, that's immoral. It's absurd to say that David morally ought, or that it's morally permissible for David to chop up the 1 guy to save the 5. But utilitarianism implies this false claim. And so that means utilitarianism has to be false, right? The logic of the argument, to make it a little bit clearer, is going to be something like this. If utilitarianism is true, well, then it'd be morally permissible to kill the one guy to save the five, right? 5 lives versus, on net, you have 4 lives, right? 5 people live, 1 dies. That's a net of +4. On the other hand, you have 5 people dying, 1 living. That's net -4. Well, clearly, according to utilitarianism, you got to choose the +4, right? So if utilitarianism is true, it's morally permissible to kill the 1 to save the 5. But it's clearly not morally permissible to kill the 1 to save the 5. And so utilitarianism must not be true, right? That's the objection. And there are lots of scenarios like this that people have thought up. People like Judith Jarvis Thompson, critics of utilitarianism. The more general idea that they point toward is that utilitarianism can't respect rights. If you recall, Peter Singer was kind of skeptical about this notion of rights. And he raised this skepticism when he was discussing Thompson's views. And what he'd pointed out is that Thompson's views rest on a particular view of rights. And Singer said, I don't think that our view is right, but I'm not going to go into that. I'll talk blah, blah, blah. And goes on to talk about something else. But now we see this division between utilitarians and Kantians when it comes to something like rights or duties on the one hand, and then utilitarianism on the other. The Kantian is going to say that utilitarianism can't make sense of rights, can't make sense of absolute prohibitions, right? Typically, we think of rights as being these things that you can't violate just because it'd make things better in some way. Utilitarianism can't allow for adequate respect for people's rights. That's what this general problem is getting at. Now, very quickly, how might a utilitarian respond? The way that many utilitarians try to respond to an example like this is by claiming that you're not taking into account all of the results and consequences. And in particular, here's what you're not taking into account. If David did this, he killed the 1 guy to save the 5. People would be horrified. People would stop going to the doctor because they'd be afraid of being carved up by their doctor, even though they're totally healthy. People would be horrified across society, be horrified that something like this happened. And they would feel a certain kind of empathy and a kind of pain for the victims and the victims' families and so on. And that pain, if you add it all up, the utilitarian might say, would outweigh the pleasure produced, the good consequences produced by saving the 5. And so if you take into account the pain that society will feel, both because they're terrified and empathize with the victims, but also because they won't be going to the doctors anymore, if you take into and then the pain that that would cause, if you take into account all that pain, it's going to outweigh the pleasure produced by saving the 5. That would be the utilitarian response. But the Kantian is just going to come back and say, well, okay, let's say I grant all that, fine. Well, if the doctor could keep it a secret, if David could do it very secretly and be reasonably certain that what he was, make sure nobody else knew about it, well, then it would be morally permissible to chop up the 1 to save the 5. And maybe in the real world, maybe it'd be very hard to make sure that something like that stays a secret. Fine. Nonetheless, the point would stand that according to utilitarianism, if you could keep it a secret, well, then you should chop up the 1 to save the 5. That utilitarianism would imply that. And what the Kantian might say is, that's absurd. Keeping it a secret doesn't make it morally permissible all of a sudden, right? That's still absurd. Utilitarianism is still giving us the wrong answer. Maybe we don't need to worry about our utilitarian doctors carving us up because they are, they're not sure if they'll be able to keep these things secret. Fine. Nonetheless, utilitarianism is giving us a clearly absurd claim, namely that if you could keep it a secret, well, yeah, then it'd be morally permissible, indeed morally obligatory, to chop up the one to save the five. That's false. And so you same problem, right? Same kind of problem. And these debates between Kantians and utilitarians, right? Kantians attacking them in this way, utilitarians attacking the formula of universal law, and so on. These go back and forth. This is what people do today. There are more philosophers doing this kind of thing today.